Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's webinar, Supplier Risk Assessment Program Best Practices. I want to start by thanking you for taking time out of your busy schedule to attending today's webinar. I'm Sanjeevni, and I today have the pleasure of facilitating the webinar. Before starting, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. Just to give a little bit of context about today's webinar, today's webinar is brought to you by Zycus in collaboration with GRMS, which is Global Risk Management Solutions. Just to give you a little bit of context about who Zycus is and what we do. Zycus is a provider not only of procure-to-pay, but in fact an integrated suite of source-to-pay modules. So in the strategic side, we have spend analytics, e-sourcing, contract management, and supplier management. On the operations side of it, or the downstream procure-to-pay side of it, we have e-invoicing, e-procurement, and a lot of other modules. Zycus has been recognized by leading analyst firms like Gartner, Forrester, and Spend Matters. Gartner has recognized Zycus as the leader for the fourth time in a row in Gartner's 2018 Magic Quadrant for strategic sourcing applications. Forrester has positioned Zycus as a leader in the Forrester Wave for contract lifecycle management in 2019, and Spend Matters has positioned Zycus as the leader under the Nimble persona for source to pay in the Q2 of 2018 in their solutions map. Another very recent milestone that Zycus is thrilled to share with you is our debut in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for procure-to-pay. This slide just tells you a little bit about why Zycus was recognized, and you can get the full report on the Gartner website as well as the Zycus website. To move ahead, I want to take you through a few upcoming events that attendees like you might find of interest. We have another webinar coming up on the 24th, which is about 10 days from now. We have 4 global procurement thought leaders coming together to discuss the impact of AI and across procurement, across modules like catalog management, like e-invoicing, like risk. So we'd love to have you attend that webinar as well. One of the main on-site events that Zycus holds in the US is our annual user conference, which is called Horizon. This is the 11th edition of Horizon that's going to be held on the 3rd to the 5th November in Charleston. And we'd love to have you attend that as well. We have a few special promo codes and a lot more information about Horizon in this slide deck that you will receive within 2 business days of this webinar. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Gerard Smith, the President at Global Risk Management Solutions, one of our most valued partners. And Gerard is also a speaker at Horizon. Thank you, Gerard, for joining us for today's webinar. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to you to talk a little bit about what GRMS does and what kind of partnership it has with Zycus.
Okay, terrific. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Gerard Smith. I'm the president of GRMS. GRMS is a supplier risk assessment firm, meaning what makes us unique is we're a service, not a data feed. So in other words, we actually validate not only data points, but a variety of different documents, which I'll show you some examples. The purpose of today's presentation is trying to provide you a baseline to at least start a conversation within your organization about the history of supplier risk assessments, as well as looking at what could be included in a supplier risk assessment program. Now, what makes us different, again, is we're not a searchable network or sourcing tool. We partnered with Zycus with the idea that Zycus is a sourcing tool and can provide you a number of analytics. In other words, if you were wanting to know your diversity spend, you could do that. We validate that the supplier really is diverse. So there's the difference between our two companies. So with that, why don't you make me the presenter? I'll go ahead and start showing my deck. And in doing so, hopefully everybody will get a good understanding of what supplier risk assessments are. So can you hand over the ball to me at this point?
Sure. I'm doing that right now. I think you should have,
So everyone should be able to see the screen at this point, I hope. Let's start with what the problem is. And again, I invite you to type in questions or ask questions. I'm not sure how do they actually ask questions. What's the best way of doing that?
So they have a chat box right there on the GoToWebinar panel. I think all attendees will be able to see the chat box. At any point, if you have any questions for our speaker, you can go ahead and type that out right there, and I can read that out to you, Gerard. Does that work?
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so if anyone has any questions as I go through, because I'm going to go through a lot of information, hopefully making it useful. And again, you will be receiving a copy of the deck, so hopefully that'll help you out. So let's start with what the problem is. In our experience, most companies have difficulty monitoring their suppliers, either because of limited internal resources or simply the costs associated with the supplier risk management. It's also challenging to keep up with the existing watch and exclusion lists because new ones are being added every day. So you have the OFAC list, which is the U.S. List under the U.S. government, under the Treasury Department, and under the Patriot Act, it says you're not allowed to do business with certain individuals and companies throughout the world, and that's called the OFAC list. But there's a variety of other watch and exclusion lists around the globe. In 2016, there were approximately 1,200 different various lists. Currently, there's more than 1,500. So anyone in procurement should be concerned about those because you don't want to do business with anybody on any of the different sanctions lists. So we've been able to identify them. Now we can actually manage to those. We also know the collection and management of the certificates of insurance creates one of the largest area of exposure for companies. You can see on the slide there, literally every company we've implemented a program for, there's over 80% of the insurance coverages are what's called non-compliant. So over 80+%, literally every company that either the coverages are non-compliant, the endorsements are wrong, the additional insured language is wrong. So no matter what they've agreed to contractually, if someone actually looked, over 80% are not in compliance. So being proactive about solving this reduces the risk of high penalties for non-compliance, but also the serious risk of financial loss. So I like to usually start with a few examples to get you to kind of understand what we're talking about. This first list is simply a question. Which, if any, of these companies are on the current U.S. OFAC list? Okay, and most individuals that look at this list may say, oh, this one or that one. But the honest answer is every one of these companies were taken straight off the OFAC list. So if you're doing business today with Car Care Center Company or Masters International or Educational Development Association, very innocuous sounding names, but the problem is there's a penalty if the government finds out. And this is, again, only one example of those 1,500 various sanctions lists around the globe. So again, it's something you need to keep an eye on. The second example is the certificates of insurance. And this slide shows some of the non-compliance statistics based on our experience with some of our clients. And most clients are really shocked by the level of non-compliance. So if you can try and imagine managing 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 certificates of insurance on a spreadsheet with different policy expiration dates, that's where the problems start. There's also several different endorsements and combinations of endorsements to manage to ensure suppliers meet your requirements. So again, it's complex, it's time consuming. A lot of companies want to outsource this. The other thing all of you as procurement individuals need to know is the additional insured language, which is the sentence at the bottom of the COI, which calls out your company as the one that's being protected, if you will. The additional insured language has to be perfect or you don't have any coverage whatsoever. So it requires a human being to actually look at all of these certificates of insurance to ensure that they truly are in compliance. The third example is somewhat U.S.-centric, but it makes a point because it applies in various different other countries. In the U.S., companies need to ensure that the name and the TIN, the tax ID number, provided on the W-9 matches the IRS tax filing records. And if not, these are the penalties that are enforced. As you can see, the penalties for noncompliance can be significant because there's no limitation. So what does the IRS require? Well, the IRS requires the W-9 be replaced when certain information is changed, such as the name or type of business entity or tax ID number or anything like that. So most companies that have programs like what we're providing collect the new W-9 every time a new one comes out to ensure that they have current and active information, that everything on the W-9 shows their current address, etc. So again, these are simply 3 examples of what companies have said. These are issues we're trying to manage, but they're difficult to manage. So some of the common areas we've looked at are these. The first one and the biggest one is not only identifying the financial stability of a supplier, but also the monitoring of it. In the past, companies used Dun & Bradstreet or other companies like that. The problem with D&B is primarily self-reported information, and it's not necessarily continuously monitored. So there's better sources both in the United States as well as around the world to get information about the financial stability of suppliers. And I'll tell you a couple of examples in just a little bit. The second one is what we talked about. Over 80% of the certificates of insurance are not in compliance. So companies are wanting to solve that issue for obvious reasons. The third one is all the various different government watch lists. The big ones right now are the U.S. Patriot Act, U.K. Modern Slavery, and if you're doing business in Europe, the GDPR requirements are very important because the penalties are very high. The diversity status is interesting. In the past, a lot of companies allowed their suppliers to self-certify, meaning they would say they're woman-owned, minority-owned, or whatever the case may be. But that's rarely true anymore. Most companies now require their suppliers actually get certified through one of the certification agencies and get a certificate. The problem with that is now it puts just an additional job on you as procurement individuals, because at that point now you have to manage the expiration date on each one of those certificates, because you don't want to claim that you're doing business with a diverse company when indeed they're not diverse. I spoke at a conference a few months ago where someone from a medical device company, a publicly traded company, came up to me and he said this is the number one issue they're trying to solve, because last year in 2018 they had to restate their diversity spend to the tune of $120 million because no one in procurement had ever validated the diverse status. And so this is, again, one of those things that, in his case anyway, he was saying that it was a real black eye, if you will, for procurement, because no one had ever bothered to validate the diversity status, and now they needed help doing that. So determining the best approach to manage and monitor suppliers are what we're going to be talking about today. So again, if you have any questions, type them in. I'm just trying to lay the foundation. So let's start with the supplier risk assessment kind of history, if you will. Over the last 20 years, we've identified 3 phases of supplier risk assessments, and your company will follow one of these 3. The first phase, 20 years ago, was when I was in procurement. I was actually in procurement at Northrop Grumman, the big aerospace company, and we self-performed everything. In other words, what happened is we'd collect the certificates of insurance. Candidly, we had no clue what we're looking at, or the W-9s, the safety documents, the T's and C's. The snapshot report 20 years ago indeed was the D&B report. At that point, we simply put it in the procurement file and promptly forgot about it because we didn't know that we were supposed to manage all of that. So its second phase evolved over time where companies contracted with data subscription services like Thomson Reuters or Dun & Bradstreet or a variety of other companies. And those companies are what's called data sources. So a data source provides inexpensive raw data, which has not been adjudicated, meaning it's not verified. It's typically not continuously monitored. And so there's some real limitations on what information you're trying to get about the supplier, not only when you're writing the contract to make sure that they can perform what they're actually contracting for, but then also monitoring it to ensure they're not getting into trouble. So we looked at it and we thought the system had to be more efficient. There had to be a better way. So a third phase evolved where GRMS created a new type of program. And GRMS is a technology-driven service company, which not only includes the adjudication of the data, but more importantly, assisting the suppliers to get into compliance. So what that means is you need to be able to adjudicate the data, but as well as the documents. In other words, you can't just expect a supplier to upload a certificate of insurance or a W-9 or other documents without anybody looking at it. It literally could be a blank piece of paper. So it requires a service, someone to actually look at each one of the documents and validate that they indeed are correct and nothing's struck out, etc. The second point is the ability to help suppliers to get into compliance. Again, if you're not working with an outside third-party risk assessment firm, then internally you have to figure out who's the person or division that's going to help troubleshoot the suppliers. In other words, what happens if a supplier says, I don't understand the insurance requirements? Or what do you mean my W-9 is expired? Or what do you mean my diversity cert is expired? Or whatever the case may be. Who do they call within your company to actually get that answer to help solve the issue so they get into compliance? We found that if we set up a centralized help desk, suppliers can contact us and we can actually help them to get into compliance. It makes it much more efficient. The third bullet, though, is the most important. We have the ability now with our platform and through Veritas, which is our platform, we push notifications into the Zycus platform, which says there's a change in status with this particular supplier. Anything that changes in terms of a status, it would be pushed into the Zycus platform, and then you, the client, would be notified, hey, there's a change for this supplier. You need to look at them before you give them more business. So a change could be they're getting into financial trouble. In other words, a predictive ability, finding out in advance, not that they filed bankruptcy last month, but they're starting to get into trouble. You need to look at them. Perhaps they've canceled their insurance. Perhaps their diversity cert has expired. Perhaps they're being sued by somebody. Anything like that, an alert is pushed into the Zycus platform with the statement that you need to look at the supplier before you give them more business. It provides you the ability, as our tagline says, to proactively manage supplier risk versus finding out after that something has gone wrong. So the intent there is to try and get ahead of the problem versus finding out there actually is a problem. So with that said, let's talk about what a world-class supplier risk assessment program should include. And these are 5 components we've identified. You can look at it and kind of compare what you're doing today to see if there's holes, if you will, or gaps in the program, and if so, how you can solve that. The first thing is that it has to be customizable. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all in terms of specific risk components applied to all the suppliers. You may want a deeper dive with your strategic, but not as deep a dive with, let's say, non-strategic. It could be based on geography, that you have different requirements in EMEA than you do in APAC. Or it could be based on risk, it could be based on spend, it could be based on a variety of things, direct versus indirect, etc. But it cannot be a one-size-fits-all. So that's a big deal. It has to be customizable. Secondarily, it has to have the ability. Yes.
Gerard, sorry to interrupt you. We have a question here. One of our attendees is asking whether there can be different risk components for non-strategic or small suppliers, and can a client select specific risk components for these kind of suppliers?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly correct. Because a small spend supplier, you may just only want to check that they're not on any government watch list. Obviously, you don't want to do business with them. And perhaps just validate that you have the W-9 and maybe do the TIN matching, let's say, if it's in the United States or whatever. That's a small spend, or perhaps you only do business with them once. But if it's a strategic, you may want to have many more components and want to know a lot more about them, and you want the continuous monitoring as far as the status of that particular supplier. So the answer is yes. That's exactly what we're talking about, the ability to have that flexibility when whatever the program looks like. So the second one is, thank you for the question. Keep them coming. Adjudication of the information. In other words, being able to validate false positives. And why that's important is this. And I'll give you a simple example. This is a better one. I got a call some months ago from a Fortune 100 company. And in this case, they had contacted us and said they had asked Dun & Bradstreet, in this case, to check their 80,000 suppliers against the OFAC list, simple request, one list. Check them and make sure none of our 80,000 suppliers are actually on the OFAC list. And D&B checked the list and came back and said, what should have been 0, maybe 1, maybe 2, they came back to this company and said, you have 7,000 potential matches, big word, potential. And so when the company called us, it was in a panic because they have to basically fire 7,000 of their suppliers. And I said, well, do you understand why that even happened? I said, the reason it happened is D&B is a data source. They had no way of validating. So if Acme was on the client list and un-Acme was on the OFAC list, they would have to call it a, quote, potential match. But what that does is it hands the hot potato back to the client to try and solve the issue. So this is where the adjudication, the system or the program that you manage has to have this ability to adjudicate false positives. And if there's a hit, has to have the ability to work with the supplier to solve the issue so you don't end up getting rid of good suppliers. The third one is the reporting capability, and this goes hand in hand with what Zycus is doing. You want to have consistent, measurable compliance standards. In other words, you want to be able to validate and be able to tell your management, this is how much we have in terms of diversity spend in these particular categories. Well, if no one's ever taken the time to validate it, how can you actually say for sure that that is correct? So what we do is we are able to validate it and then push the results, what we call the risk rating, into the Zycus platform, listing each of the different components that have applied to that particular supplier, with the idea that now you can report to your management exactly how many suppliers are in compliance, and if they're not, what the specific issue is. The document verification and management, it's nice to collect and manage documents. A lot of companies do that, but do you validate the documents? That's the trick. So this is where it becomes more of a service, the ability to validate. Now, a simple example. Let's say you have a certificate of insurance. We go back to that example. Obviously, you want to make sure that not only do they have the correct coverages, but they continue to have the correct coverages to make sure that your company's protected. When I was in procurement, we collected the COI, Certificate of Insurance, day one, and we never looked at it again. So the suppliers were reducing the amounts or canceling the policy because no one was paying attention. So what we've decided to do is address that in terms of monitoring it. So in other words, the supplier gets insurance, you're listed, your company's listed as the additional insured, and we're listed as what's called a certificate holder. So anytime there's a material change, we're notified, meaning we're actually notified that let's say they've canceled the policy or they didn't pay the premium or anything like that. What happens is we actually contact the supplier and tell them they have to fix that particular issue because they're no longer in compliance with the requirements. And we tell the client at the same time, because wouldn't it be nice for you to know if a supplier who's coming on property doesn't have insurance and you're not protected? That's obviously something you want to make sure you protect the company. And then the fifth one is this idea of continuous monitoring in a variety of areas. In other words, the financial stability, that's important, the diversity certs, perhaps what's called adverse media. There's a variety of things, but in real time telling you, hey, there's an issue and you need to look at that particular issue. So the idea here would be if these 5 components are kind of the baseline, if you will, on a world-class program. And so if you look at these and you go, well, we're not exactly doing this, this may be kind of a roadmap for you to start looking at it and trying to determine what's the best way to manage it. So do we have any other questions about these 5 at all?
No, I don't think we do at this point.
Okay, so let's talk about some risk areas that you might want to consider. We've identified kind of 8 buckets, if you will, of things that you need to do in terms of looking at these and determining whether it applies to your organization. And I'm going to give you some ideas of what can be included in each one of these, but we've kind of broken down to these 8 modules, buckets, whatever you want to call them. So financial stability, we talked about the ability to manage the financial stability and being able to find information in real time. Now, there's different sources, D&B, obviously, Thomson, Experian, Equifax. There's a variety of different sources around the globe. We found that in the United States, the best one is actually Experian because they provide what's called a financial risk score, and we can monitor it. So a risk score is an actual numeric number between 1 and 5, 1 being the best, 5 being the worst. So Experian is a credit bureau, so a supplier can't influence the actual rating. It's just like all of you have an Experian credit score. It basically says, are you paying your bills on time, etc. Well, they have the same thing for businesses, both private and public. So this provides the ability for you to manage and say, well, if it's a 1 or 2, they're in good financial shape. They can pass. But if it's a 3, flag it. Someone needs to look at it. And if it's a 4 or 5, fail them because they're in financial trouble. So the financial stability is not just a moment in time as it has in the past where you just look at it when you sign the contract, but you have to monitor it. Because the last thing you want to do is send out a PO or worse, send out a check and the supplier can't perform. The other thing you might want to consider is looking at bankruptcies, liens, and judgments monitoring, because if there's a lien against a supplier, then there's an issue and you need to make sure you're aware of it. So again, it depends on the country. I'm making some of the examples U.S., but Equifax, again, has the international business profile. They have a variety of sources. So the financial stability is the number one area. The insurance we've talked about, it's called Certificate of Insurance in the U.S., evidence of insurance globally. Getting the insurance certificate, being able to read it and be able to manage to it, obviously, is paramount. The reputational protection is interesting. There's different ways of getting it. We do what's called global adverse media monitoring. And what that means is we're managing to about 35,000 publications around the world. And what we're looking for is negative stories about your suppliers. A negative story could be they're being sued by somebody, or they're suing somebody, or something along those lines. And the idea would be you'd want to know about that because you want to make sure that if there's an issue that you're aware of it to see whether it's going to impact your company. So reputational protection can be in a variety of different ways. That's one of the ways that we do it, but there's other ways also. The regulatory compliance is anything that's a government regulation. That kind of falls into that bucket. So it's obviously the global watch list monitoring, those 1,500 we keep talking about. It could be conflict mineral declaration, the California Transparency Act, UK Modern Slavery Act, REACH, ROHS. Anything that's a government regulation kind of falls into that. Oftentimes it requires documents to be collected. Sometimes it's ISO search, as simply as a document and managing to that document and its expiration date. But anything that's a regulation falls in that group. Cyber is the biggest area. This is, at least this year, it's probably the biggest, one of the biggest. It can either be a security scorecard rating. It could be collecting and managing information like a security questionnaire. Every company does this slightly differently because normally their IT organization security wants to know. Basically, what we do is we're checking the global IP footprint and identifying if there's problems, and if so, telling the supplier and the client that there is a problem with that particular supplier. So again, security is a big deal, obviously, and cybersecurity is something that not only is important in terms of finding out the right answers, but then it impacts your insurance because if they're touching your IT system, you want cyber insurance. See how it all relates. The document management, as I said, it's not just managing, collecting and managing, but also validating any standardized document. It has to have the ability, again, to look at it and actually validate that. Let's just say hypothetically you have a code of conduct and you tell it every supplier has to sign this code of conduct. But let's say a supplier doesn't like a sentence that your company's written. They strike it out, initial it, and upload it in the platform. Well, since no one's looked at it, by default, you've agreed to it, even though you don't even know it. You've already agreed to it. So again, this is where the document management requires human intervention to look at every one of these documents and validate them. Social responsibility. We talked about the diversity verification. That's obviously an important one. Slavery and human trafficking analysis for some companies is very important. Sustainability, all of those type of things fall in the social bucket, if you will. And then health and safety could include collecting and managing HSC questionnaires, EMR ratings, OSHA statistics, and all of that. So the idea here would be is that, again, someone questioned earlier, it doesn't have to include all of these. Perhaps a strategic supplier would touch all of these, but a non-strategic may only have 2 of these or 3 of these or whatever the case may be. So the intent here is being able to mix and match, have a standardized program as much as you can, but also have the flexibility of knowing that you can address unique requirements based on different types of suppliers. So any questions about this from anybody? Because I'm trying to give you some examples of what can be done.
No, Gerard, not yet.
Okay.
I'll let you know if there are any questions.
Let's see. I'm coming down to my last slide, so then we're going to have to really come up with some good questions. So here's some benefits in terms of establishing a supplier risk assessment program. And it provides you visibility that you may not have today in terms of your supply chain and where the problem suppliers are. One of the companies we do this for is CBRE, the largest facility management company in the world. And we found that it was interesting because they had different requirements for different clients. In other words, let's say Bank of America had different requirements than Walgreens or Hewlett-Packard or whatever. And so what happened is we could actually address those unique requirements and then roll it up so that CB can see all the information. And then they did supplier rationalization, meaning they identified where the problem suppliers were and replace them with stronger suppliers that had already gone through the risk assessment program. So it provided them the visibility across the entire world where the problem suppliers are, and if there was specific ones that were problematic, either get them into compliance or find another one to replace them. So the objective, obviously, is to protect your brand. That's what procurement's responsibility is. And the intent here would be is that coming alongside Zycus and GRMS, it provides you the standardized program to have a global program, so where you have various risk components, as we call them, applied to different types of suppliers, and then produce that risk rating, which again gets posted into the Zycus platform along with each risk component. So it would list each of the risk components, and the idea would be if they're compliant, yes or no, and if the answer is no, what's the issue? Perhaps it says insurance. You require 5 million E&O, they have 1 million E&O. Well, now you can make a good business decision. Is it absolutely necessary for this particular supplier or not? So that's the goal of the program, to come alongside clients and help them to standardize the program globally. So with that, that's the information I wanted to go through today, albeit that it might be a little bit shorter than we expected. But does anyone have any questions for me at this point?
Gerard, so one of the attendees has asked, what are the other benefits that clients can expect out of a partnership like the one with GRMS and Zycus?
Well, what it does is it does two things. One, it provides the visibility if there is a problem supplier, especially if it's a strategic supplier. Recently, we showed a large oil and gas company in this case. They had given us 5 of their suppliers. We did the risk assessment, and it turned out one of them was one of their big strategic ones, and that company was in financial trouble. They had no clue that one of their biggest suppliers was in financial trouble until we actually checked on it and then provided them the information. So part of the visibility of seeing the problem suppliers is one of the benefits. The second one, in the partnership with Zycus and GRMS, it provides you kind of the best of both worlds. We don't do the spend analysis. We singularly do risk, and vice versa. Zycus doesn't do risk. They rely on us. So it provides you the ability, if you're currently a Zycus client where they're uploading documents, in folding together both companies into one program, what happens is now you're validating every one of those documents. They're just not uploading them in the platform. So it's a win-win, and the diversity spend is truly validated. So you can go to your senior management and say, yes, this really is the real numbers. Other questions?
That's great, Gerard. Thank you so much. I think that's about it. I don't see any questions right now. Maybe we will get questions later on. So I'll just take the control back so I can take the attendees through how they can reach out to you if in case they have a question or they want to talk more about the partnership.
Yeah, perfect.
So just 1 second. Yeah.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. You're going to see on the screen there my contact information in just a second. And if you have any questions, if I can help you at all, that's my direct phone number and my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm here to try and help out wherever we can. So feel free. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So as Gerard said, here are his contact details. You can reach out to him anytime after the webinar in case you have any questions or you want to talk about some problem regarding supplier management that you might have. So thank you so much, Gerard, for taking time out and coming in, sort of speaking to our attendees about the topic and taking their questions. I want to thank all attendees for attending this webinar, taking time out of their busy schedule to give us about 40 to 45 minutes of their time. And just a couple of more things that I want to take the attendees through before we end the webinar for today. So as I mentioned before, we do have a user conference coming up in the month of November, in the first week of November, which is from the 3rd to the 5th November in Charleston, South Carolina. This is an annual flagship conference and the 11th edition of it. It's called Horizon, which is, like I said, going to be held in Charleston, South Carolina. We have a few promo codes that the attendees can use to register for this and avail a discount of $200 if they have other colleagues that they want to bring along. They can avail group discounts for this conference. This conference sees about 250 plus senior level procurement attendees, networking and sharing best practices across companies. You also see leading analysts in attendance from Spend Matters, Forresters, Hackett, etc. You also see major global thought leaders and influencers across the procurement domain coming in, talking about the trends, talking about best practices. So since this year's topic is revolving around digitalization, that is what our thought leaders and customer practitioner speakers will be talking about. Gerard is also one of the speakers, so if you wish to meet him, you can definitely register for Horizon and get a chance to speak to him face-to-face. So that's about it. The slide deck also has an agenda snapshot of what Horizon consists of and what do the 3 days entail. So we can also have custom packages and custom discounts made in case you're interested in attending. You can write to us or you can click on this and register for Horizon so we can help you out with any kind of problem that you have or you're facing with the registrations, or in case there are specific group packages that you might want, we'll be able to help you with that. So with that, I think we will end today's webinar. Thank you again for attending today's webinar. You can expect to receive a handout as well as a recording of today's webinar within 2 business days. Thank you all. Thank you.